Every single year, billions upon billions of animals are genocided in some of the most ruthless ways imaginable for our own futile and marginal benefit. I want to be clear, on opposition bench, they do not get to invent a hypothetical counterfactual world that would have mythically been worse and try to win on that basis. Why? Because the process of domestication has been going on for thousands of years throughout human history, and it would have happened inevitably. Why? One, because it was the most efficient way for human people to be able to get access to high levels of dense calories that previously were inaccessible and often led to the loss of human life. It was a necessary component of creating society as it is today. So for opposition to try to claim that the counterfactual would have been much worse is quite unlikely, given that this is a process that was inevitable. The second reason is that this also allowed humans to get access to raw materials that were essential to building the structures that we use to underpin society, meaning that there was an incentive to do this anyway. Additionally, animals had no option in this, meaning that there isn't some counterfactual world in which somehow this doesn't happen for reasons exogenous to human development, given that there was no capacity for that to have been the case. I also want to be clear, the alternative world in which animal rights somehow get proselytized more under opposition side of the house also isn't true. Firstly, because again, throughout human history, that has not necessarily developed, and secondly, because humans have always voted in such a way and constructed such a society in such a way wherein they preference their own interests and desires over that of animals, suggesting that animal rights have not always been such a priority for human people that this isn't necessarily a metric that we use when deciding things. So, two arguments for opening government. First, the large-scale slaughter of non-human animals. Let's be clear as to how it is that this domestication happened. Domestication was a process done wherein humans started herding animals in bigger and bigger enclaves and started controlling their movement, made it impossible for them to leave a particular place, and started training them to be able to behave in ways that were beneficial for humans and killing those who did not act in those ways. Meaning that the critical mass that kept on getting bigger and bigger through human access to these animals is what leads to a lot of specific and unique harms. The first is that of genetic engineering. Why is this? Well, because this is something that straight up would not have been possible without putting all animals in one specific cage together and not allowing them to leave, and having specific desirable traits that human people wanted and killing every single animal that did not meet those structures. What were those? First of all, for example, in a lot of dogs and other home animals, we genetically engineered them in order to be cute and desirable to humans. This has led to wide-scale genetic problems for a lot of animals such as pugs, who now no longer have the ability to breathe independently on their own. The scale of this argument is that this is billions of animals across all of human history who were either killed when they were babies because they didn't have specific features that they wanted, and animals that exist today that have no ability to live healthy and fruitful lives outside of very strict human controls. So this is a disastrous outcome in that regard, and it only would have happened in a world in which we have this critical mass, because we would not have had the ability to geoengineer these animals had they been able to live free and other means. Secondly, we are committing a genocide hundreds of times larger than every single human genocide ever as a result of this domestication. Why? The first reason is that there's been an artificial increase in the amount of animals born and then promptly killed for humans. Why? Because inasmuch as capital has always had an interest to produce animals, that is to say, you sell their hide, you sell their meat and stuff like that, it means that you're always trying to incentivize them to breed as much as possible. You are artificially forcing them into doing this. And secondly, you always had the capacity to do this because people were able to expand the amount of lands that they were able to have control over, meaning that the more animals that ended up being born, the more they were able to control the ways in which these animals behaved. Critically though, the development of law throughout history has treated animals as property, meaning that these animals had no countervailing way to be supported in instances in which they were mistreated. Why? Because inasmuch as societally we have constructed animals to be subhuman and therefore less important, it means that you as a property owner of animals have had license to do whatever you want with them. This means that if you mistreat them in a lot of circumstances, or you put them in abusive situations, by and large, that has been acceptable, and there hasn't been outside forces that can act against you to do this. The second reason is that there's been an induced demand. Previously, there wasn't as much of an interest in the consumption of meat and the consumption of animal byproducts, but because a lot of farmers started having massive amounts more animals and would make more money the more of them that they sold, it became an induced demand onto the public to eat more meat, to use more animal products on a daily basis. This means that this specific method of control meant that more animals were born and then killed, and there was more of an interest among the humans to be able to kill them. Why is it then that they were killed greater than ever? Because the financial interest at play in order to make sure that you could actually sell as much meat as possible was to invent high levels of machinery breed that learns how to kill these animals quickly and efficiently. You would slaughter them in ways that were as efficient as possible, so that way you can have more meat to bring to the market and push out your other competitors, or at the very least sell it to more people. And also this meant you optimized ways to kill them, meaning you found new and unique ways to be able to kill all of these other types of animals. First, before I continue, closing, did you have anything?
Just a little confused. Why are humans more vegetarian on your side?
I don't give a shit if they are or aren't, right? We don't have to prove that they would be more vegetarian on our side, just that there has been a significant increase in the amount of absolute murders of them than would have been possible previously is sufficient to say that this has been worse, especially when there isn't countervailing incentives to be able to protect them. The last reason why it is that this has been able to happen more is because we've divorced ourselves from the process of actually using human animals. I eat a lot of chicken and beef. I have never personally killed a cow or a chicken. This is the case for most people around us. This meant that it became more culturally acceptable to be able to kill these animals because you lived in bad faith in relation to the actions that your consumption habits allowed. You became okay with killing more animals. You became with wasting animal byproducts that you had because you never had to live with the reality of it, which meant that people no longer felt the consequences of using these things inefficiently. This has led to bad, deathly outcomes for these animals. Lastly, we have undermined animal autonomy. Why is this the case? Well, because in a lot of circumstances, animals have genetic predispositions for how it is that they would like to be able to live their life that we as humans have drastically undermined. Think of the amount of animals who would love to be able to walk 10 kilometers a day outside and get a large run in, but are forced to sit in small apartments in the middle of large cities who would never have the ability to go outside. But notice that this is at scale. It's not just specific types of dogs. Fish are drastically decreased in their ability to swim anywhere or have any diversity in their meals. These are animals who have sentience, they are able to communicate with us to some extent, and they have their own inner feelings to a pretty decent extent, which is important. And lastly, we punish animals for acting like animals. If a dog bites someone, it gets killed. This means that they have no ability to act in ways that are natural to themselves. Very proud to propose.
Oh, sorry. Sure.
Okay, I'm good to start. I'll start my speech at my first word. OG will lose this round because they failed to engage with their fundamental comparative. I'm going to use this as the one extraneous point of rebuttal before moving on to our case. They're wrong when they say that domestication was necessary for the development of the human race. We think very much humanity develops to a similar level of development as it does today, but in a far more inhumane way to animals. Why? Because I don't think the fundamental step to human development was the domestication of animals. It was the Fertile Crescent and the Agrarian Revolution. This is what actually gave humanity the access to excess calories so that they can produce starchy and heavy carby grains that give people enough food so that you can have labor specialization within your society, right? This is Max Weber 101. When you have an excess of food, people are able to do other jobs, so you're able to actually develop and progress as a society. I think there are very many easy intuition pumps for this. Look at natives in Northern America. They did not domesticate very many animals, if any at all, yet they were still able to reach a very genuine level of human development before obviously the Spanish and Americans came and everything got fucked up. But you know what I mean? So obviously humanity can develop without the excess domestication of animals. Moving on to our case then, three key points. First of all, I think life in the wild for animals absolutely sucks, and the best thing we did for them is ensure that a larger proportion of animals live in domesticated environments. I think it sucks for three reasons. First of all, I think we domesticated largely prey, and crucially panel, largely large and intelligent animals. These are the most important actors within the debate. Presumably, frogs also suffer on both sides, but we care about that significantly less than we care about the suffering of cows, of pigs, of sheep. We want them to live in the best, the best possible environments, right? So why does it suck to exist as intelligent prey? Because I think you basically only exist to be hunted and to be eaten. I think you're always profoundly stressed because you have to be as an evolutionary response to avoid so much danger. Think about, for example, mice. Most mice will literally die of a heart attack if you're in the wild and you touch them like too hard because they're so stressed they're gonna get eaten all of the time. I think you live in a constant like state of fear and psychological anguish. And also, like just when you consider the energy period, there are a bunch of predators on top whose only form of sustenance is you, but they can only derive so much sustenance even though you can technically provide a lot of calories. That means a significant proportion of prey exists, just will get eaten for the fundamental reasons that predators exist and are somehow surviving in the ecosystem. Secondly, I think the most common case of death for life in the wild is hunger, right? And I think like this is very obvious because it's pretty easy to reproduce and it's like evolutionary beneficial for you to try to reproduce as much as possible, but it's not guaranteed that all of the offspring that will be produced can find food in their environment to sustain themselves. But I think hunger is the most kind of painful death imaginable, right? Because first of all, evolutionary, it's the like stimulus you're most developed to respond to because it can kill you very quickly, like hunger in first, right? And secondly, I think it like destroys you mentally because there's a horrible spiral of you as an animal feeling powerless when you're hungry because you literally have less energy, because you're literally able to do less things, but because of that you're less likely to find food and you feel hungry and hungrier and you just spiral until you die in this painful and slow manner, which for some animals can last for a very long time later. Thirdly, on internal competition, notice this is the best case for government. If these herbivores are doing well in the environment and they're kind of dominating, there are a bunch of them, they're not suffering from excessive predation. I think this is maybe the worst outcome for them for two reasons. First of all, there's a lot of forced internal competition. This develops through evolution naturally to like prevent evolutionary stagnation. Think about, again, frogs, I'm coming back to it. They have a bunch of young and a bunch of eggs because most of them will just end up eating each other. This is purposefully done so that you can force evolutionary pressures so that the young can survive. This can develop in all animals and likely do if herbivores like excessively get to develop. I think this is horrible because then most of you are born to die and to die very quickly without even experiencing any of the benefits of life. I think that most existence is suffering on their side. And secondly, on parasitism and disease, I think the more like members you have of the same species, the more likely parasites that feast on you and ruin your life and kind of just stay within you and make you feel horrible all the time are likely to develop on their side. And fourthly, just quickly on accidental self-harm, I think it's very likely and easy that like horses that are galloping and running break their own leg and then they fall and they kind of like whimper there until a wolf comes and eats them alive. I think it's very easy for like deer and other animals to do similar things. Like the environment is tough to navigate and these animals aren't profoundly intelligent. A lot of them just kill themselves in like suffering and dumb ways. Secondly, why I think domestication was relatively okay and a good thing for these animals? 4 reasons. First of all, I think the vast majority of modern governments implement significant laws for animal rights, like things that like regulate their living conditions, how you have to slaughter them, blah, blah, blah. On weighing here, I think a good amount of animals exist, like that have ever existed, have existed in the past 30 years because of factory farming that like really kicked off, like, okay, maybe after the Industrial Revolution. So that's when these laws were developed, and I think then that's when most of these animals were treated relatively humanely. Secondly, I think it's often not in your human incentive to inflict suffering on these animals, right? For example, disease. You pump them with antibiotics and you pump them with medication, which is good for you, but also keeps them healthier and keeps them less likely to suffering from disease than they would on their side. Thirdly, I think just most religions prescribe like humane killing and treatment laws for animals. Think about like kosher slaughter laws in like Abrahamic religions. And fourthly, I think like people increasingly the status quo just generally health aware and they tie their well-being to the well-being of the animals they consume. Think about like grass-fed meat, pasture-raised, hormone-free, whatever. I think then again, because this is in the status quo, because a lot of animals exist in like factory farming conditions, this is like very good for them. Before moving on to like domestication, I'll take a point from closing.
So you seriously say that breaking a leg is worse than, I don't know, getting multiple degrees of cancer because you're in a factory?
I think when you get multiple diseases and multiple degrees of cancer is when you have no access to humans that have an incentive to keep you as healthy as possible. It's when you're at the mercy of the environment. Thirdly then, on why domestication likely leads to like positive treatment of animals and why this developed on our side. I think it's because most people have a good like positive contact throughout history with animals. First of all, because of a positive relationship with them. You have pets, you have the goat your family keeps for milk. They're fluffy, they're cute, they're not afraid to use to develop a personal relationship. And secondly, on media. I think like from the time of ancient Greeks, we have animal anthropomorphized fables that like portray them as very good actors. I don't think like you're able to on government develop the love and affection for these animals. I think their comparative is killing them for food and still hunting them because they're nutritious and delicious. Why is this worse? First of all, because you're obviously likely to treat them less humanely, and secondly, crucial, the real horrible thing about their comparative, there's a fundamental lack of separation between domesticated and wild ecosystems. So in government, animals are hunted from food from wild ecosystems, and this fucks up everything because you have to remove certain species disproportionately, and this ruins your ecosystem for two reasons. First of all, like some of the species, like you compete over some of the species that compete with the species you hunted overbreed, and secondly, their predators that fed on them also die, which are supposedly also moral actors we have to care about. This leads to, first of all, a spread of disease because you have an overwhelming amount of one species of animals in one system, and they die horrible deaths in this way. Or secondly, on parasitism, because they're a very easy thing to access through like food chains, water chains, and they die horrible deaths in that way. So proud to propose, even prouder to propose for Zagreb. Oh, oppose.
I thank leader of the opposition for that speech. Now we continue the case of opening government. Let's welcome Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The halls of history have already deemed the actions of humans against animals as the most inhumane and most wrong. There are many animals that have already went extinct. We constantly see them bred only to suffer, even in those conditions that they say most optimal at the hands of an owner, beyond the fact that billions and billions are killed every single year just for our own pleasure and for our own sustenance. It's on those grounds we would rather they run wild and free. What am I going to do? I'm going to run through their comparative and explain to you why our side's better. Then I'm going to do some way and explain to you why Ethan's case wins. So firstly, they say life sucks in the wild because you exist to be hunted and eaten. 4 responses. Firstly, this is natural, which means that in terms of autonomy, at least they're living the life that they were predisposed to actually live. Secondly, in this analysis, is that evolution seeks for resilience and pain avoidance in this capacity, but notably this is uncomparative on their subhouse, because the problem with our systemic version of this is that we overload it to a point where evolution cannot respond. That is, humans' capacity to do this in the last hundreds of years has not allowed it to do so. But within the millennia that these animals that existed, they have developed these kinds of pain avoidance in order to improve their lifespans. Think about all these evolutionary techniques animals have developed, like for example, different kinds of mice and everything else to hide, to be able to survive and to increase their lifespan and to increase the ability of reproduction and survivability. This is why ecosystems maintain stability on their subhouse. But on our subhouse, they cannot avoid the destruction of humanity, the systemic and large asymmetry and capacity in order for them to enslave them, in order for them to kill them, in order for them to act against them in those many types of ways. Which means, no, their life is not in constant agony. Secondly, these animals can actually defend themselves. It is much harder for you to get hunted. For example, you might get injured, but you might still survive. You might have collective breed. You might have a collective community of animals like elephants walking in a herd. On their house, you are screwed against one human with a rifle who will definitively kill you in Africa as they hunt you for your ivory. And then thirdly, it is, and lastly, most importantly, this debate is about suffering and how much they have it and whether life was worse comparatively. This is about their life leading up to it. So sure, even if they get hunted and killed and their life ends at that moment, on their side of the house, their life in perpetuity up to that point, up from till they're born, is extreme suffering. On our side of the house, you were born as a young rat. You engage that family connection. You're able to live and try to survive. Maybe you live 5 months. Maybe you, for example, live 2 years, but you live a good life. On their side of the house, it is pure suffering thing and through, which is why comparatively, theirs comparative of killing is worse. Secondly, they say you die of hunger. 1, ecosystems maintain natural levels of balance even if human intervention intervention required to maintain stable supply. 2, living life years in of itself is not a good if you are perpetual years of suffering. So I will admit animals might die younger, but that's okay because this is the natural condition that they're supposed to die in, and they're not engaging in suffering up until that point, unlike their side of the house where they are bred for a certain amount of time just to live and everything else. They also have developed systems of food and acquisitions like bears. They, for example, rest during winter seasons, or for example, they might collect food. Like the system naturally creates ways that they're able to survive longer. Third, they say parasites and disease. This is a woefully crazy claim to make comparatively because animals in their conditions in these factories and domestications breed the perfect conditions to create the diseases that require mass culling and mass suffering because of the fact that you are keeping them in these tight conditions, structurally speaking, where you minimize the amount of protections and safety conditions and everything else because you don't see them as real, you don't see them as rights, and because this is the most profitable way to extract value out of them. And lastly, accidental self-harm. This is uncomparative and speculative. Ours is guaranteed. The harm you cause them when they're in that factory, when they're at that home, when you smack the animal because they're acting wrong, this is more or less assured. Them saying you speculate might harm yourself is not necessarily true. Next, they say domestication was okay and that government's animal rights implement this. Is gut check yourself, honorable speakers. And what fucking world have animals been treated okay, and we do not understand this to be true. But let me give you 4 structural reasons in case you're not convinced. Firstly, we have speciesism. Religion does not see animals and do not protect them the way she just does. I don't know what pastor they went to that actively preaches about animal rights and their things, but the problem is that it's not proximate to humans. They don't experience these things, and they fundamentally can't relate to animal suffering. Notably, they even evolve animals to make it such that they can't even see their suffering. A pug, I look at them like cute that their nose is like, for example, not Bill Brief, but they are suffering, and I cannot practically understand the significance of this kind of action. Secondly, Ethan provides you the capital interest and the selfish interest of the humans, which overweighs them because of capacity. Animals have no capacity to represent, to rally, to create a government. It is these people that create these conditions for them, and they have a perpetual interest to make things cheaper and worse if they can, and to optimally create the conditions for animal optimization for themselves, but suffering at the other hand. But lastly, it's this cognitive dissonance because you do not experience these things. Most people do not see the harm, which is why, for example, I'm like, I could admit factories farming was bad, but I'm going to probably go eat a steak afterwards. And lastly, most people don't have time and capacity to rally. They care mostly about their own proximate conditions, which means you don't do it. Next, they say, like, for example, people engage in grass-fed meat and everything else, and that's good. There is no capital incentive for this. The economic system is one where the less land you use, the less you feed animals, the more you inject them with all sorts of shit to grow them, the more you genetically engineer them, is the more profitable way to maintain our status quo domestication, which means their thing only affects like maybe the 0.01% of these rich people who would afford and who are likely to actually care about these things. But in the practice of billions of humans in the world, they do not care about the way they engage with them. Closing. Opening.
Engage with your comparative. People still develop and they still crave meat because of the calories and because of it's tasty. So
Sure.
you still hunt the meat.
Sure. So the response there is very simple. You can't kill all animals in the ecosystem because it collapses, which means that like even if you have to kill them terminally at the end on both sides of the house, the journey to doing that has to be different because on their side of the house, their side of the house, you could just mass manufacture animals and engage in suffering and doesn't care about ecosystem stability. On our side of the house, you have to let some animals exist. You have to let them lead a life of some sort, which means again, the journey is what matters here. The end destination is not what is the consequential weighing tipping point on either side of the house. So ultimately speaking, what do you give you on our side of the house? We firstly give you structure where animals are bred for humans and selective breeding prioritizes things like growth and yields, which means you have fat animals that live in under bad conditions and are constant suffering throughout all their lives and engage in compliance. They have pain, deformities, diseases, and inability to perform natural behaviors. You have domestication where animals are bred to rely on for food for reproduction and survival, which means you have plenty of stray animals, for example, in Brazil, who just die because they can't even find a way to live and they can't even engage in the type of lifestyle that they would have wanted to live otherwise because of physical traits incompatible with their life. We explained to you why they have no alternative on their side of trying to actually save these species. So the weighing is very clear. Firstly, on scale, wild animals exist anyways and they'll exist on both sides of the house. But domestication adds billions of animals who exist solely to be exploited, which means in terms of pain and suffering on a fucking unfathomable scale, we outweigh them. But secondly, in terms of intensity, humans' actions create certainty in the structural conditions because we only care about ourselves and we're bred for the capital incentive to make it better for us, which means we guaranteed create the conditions that create animal suffering. We guaranteed create that pug. We guaranteed create that factory farm. But on their side of the house, their harms are very speculative. You breaking a leg in the nature. The ecosystem may collapse because of some kind of thing, even though they create order and naturally reproduces in the way that it does. So ultimately, there's a permanence of their side. The pet that has to wait at home because they're lonely because you won't buy another pet because you can't afford it. The pet that, for example, is hurt. Ultimately, proud to propose.
Now to close the debate for the opening half, I call Deputy Leader
I spent my Christmas looking at National Geographic this year, which is kind of lame, but I also think kind of cool. Because before I looked at it, I had the same conception of wildlife as opening government does. Animals live nicely for a couple of years, then a predator comes and kills them, which is like, at the same time, they did have a nice life, but the death was brutal. This, unfortunately, is not true, nor is this the comparative within the debate. Comparative within the debate is you're born and you have to be afraid that your siblings are going to eat you because you're hungry. Then you have to be afraid every time your mother goes to seek food that the predator is going to kill you. Every time you go and have water on the pond, all the predators are also there. And as you put your nose into the water in your mouth to get the water, the alligator jumps and then mauls you, and you go to the bush and you die in extreme pain. This is the comparative. But I don't think this is the only push from opening government, because opening government also says that even if life in wildlife is brutal, the reason why they still win is because on our side of the house, we produce billions of animals more. And to here, I'm going to do a simple weighing. I'd like to say that the prerequisite to any right and any utility in your life is you actually having a life, which means that all the animals on our side of the house, even if they suffer, still have more utility than comparatively to an opening government where they're never born. But I want to do a couple of points of extraneous rebuttal here on the analysis we bring. The first thing that they say is that it's okay that animals die because this is natural. So it's like that humans are above animals in the hierarchy. So I'd say if natural is being the justification, I'd say that humans eating animals is also natural, so animals should be fine with it by their analysis. The second thing you say is you evolved to not feel pain. This isn't true. You evolved to feel even more pain in the wilderness, because every time you feel pain, you want it to be as bad for you to remember not to do it again, because you're an instinctual animal, meaning that everything that happens on their side, every time you get hurt, you probably feel it more than you should. The third thing that they say is animals can defend each other, and the worst thing that happens is you get hurt. Firstly, no, because I think Domagoj has nice analysis as to why all the animals we domesticated are the ones being preyed on, are the weaker animals that cannot defend themselves. But secondly, getting wounded isn't a nice thing. You are literally left to die in horrible conditions while you suffer in long pain. I don't think this is really the comparative you should be defending. But what is their comparative here? We believe that there are three reasons as to why you still hunt animals, and those are the reasons given to us by opening government. The first one is they are calorie dense. The second one is you do need raw materials, and the third one is they are easy access to food. This is why you still go out and kill them, you still go out and hunt them. The only response coming from opening government is you care about ecosystem. Firstly, considering their characterizations of humans, I don't know why you care about ecosystems. Secondly, there are ways to hunt them and kill them without destroying the ecosystem, by like making it cyclical, etc., which means that you are still likely to go out and hunt them. Secondly, know that your view of animals is less humane. Why? Because you don't have the sympathy for animals. Insofar you never heard the old MacDonald had a farm, or you never saw a teddy bear named Ted who is like extremely crude, but you still feel some kind of connection to them. This means you only ever experience them as preyers. You only ever experience them as source of food, and you only experience them as someone willing to harm you, which means you're likely more brutal in the way in which you kill them. But what is then their comparative? It's threefold. The first one is that people do kill animals because of threat and because of food. The second one is that there is mass destruction of ecosystem, because note the analysis Domagoj gives you. By separating farming and by separating wildlife, what we allowed is for wildlife to have a normal hierarchy, to have an ecosystem. Insofar we go into these ecosystems and we kill all the prey, or we kill all the predators, we are literally dooming animals to die within the ecosystem, which means that this is the only way to keep the balance within the ecosystem, to keep preservation life within these ecosystems. But thirdly, know that there is also no replacement of species. What we do on our side is, yes, we do breed them after we kill them, but this is the only way in which animals access life, and in which we access like the prolongation of species. But because of all these reasons, we believe they do not defend their real comparative. Before going on, I'll take closing.
Why do people hunt this much meat? Like my grandpa just ate like one meat a month.
This is the literal analysis coming from your opening, which is the analysis that this is calorie dense, which means it's much harder to farm than to just kill a cow. Actually, like one cow is enough to eat 3 pounds of meat a day for a year. I saw that on Twitter the other day. Secondly, what are the conditions within domestication, and why do we believe they're becoming better? And know why this analysis is important, because majority of animals do live in the modern world. They're not killed like they were killed 30 years ago. They live now because of 3 reasons. Firstly, because of the expansion of technology, which has allowed us to have more of them. Secondly, you also have population rise in the world, which means we demand more of them. Thirdly, you have globalization, which means that companies are also expanding. So why is domestication right now good, and why are the majority of animals either living now or they are going to be living in the next 10 or 20 years, which are the majority of animals alive, living in good conditions? Firstly, you do have animal rights, and people are sensitive to animals. Like, remember when the streamer Hassan electrocuted his dog, and then everyone saw it, and it was the biggest news and biggest trending news on Twitter. Obviously, people do care, and obviously you do have rights of animals. Secondly, know that people also the reason why people used to not care about animals because they were relatively poor and unwell and they had to struggle for themselves. In a situation in which the living standard increases, empathy of people for other creatures also increases because you do not see them as threat, you do not see them as necessary for your survival. This means when you know you have tofu for protein, you also know you do not have to kill the little chicken that you heard songs about, which means that in the future it is more and more likely that we have less of killings of animals and extortion of animals and we have more sympathy towards them. But thirdly, people care about themselves and we can see this. This means that first you do not want your chicken to be fed with hormones and you do not want them to have cancer and horrible crap in itself. And you also have increasing laws regarding this. For example, EU regulation what meat has to be like, meaning the majority of people are more likely to opt into the humane ways. But secondly, people also want to perceive themselves as good people, which means that insofar PETA repeats to you enough times that the meat that you're eating is literally made by your chicken having cancer, you probably are less likely to eat that meat. So why is it, and thirdly on the point about religion, opening government just says, all religions subjugate animals to humans. We don't believe that to be true. Look at kosher food. Look at the idea of reincarnation, one of the greatest nations in the world, largest population side, believing that you can be reincarnated by in an animal form, thus caring about the animals. So we believe that currently the situation is rapidly improving. The situation on their side of the house could never improve, and we believe that just on scale of how many animals go through this or that treatment, we win this debate. But thirdly, why is our empathy towards animals crucial, and why is this crucial for preservation of life, which is prerequisite to any other form of utility? Because animals go extinct even without us. Even before we domesticated them, even before we started farming them, animals were going extinct and animals were dying. What are the things that we do? Because we care about animals and we go to zoos and we connect with rare species that we would never do on their side. Firstly, we do genetically engineer. We make sure that animals can survive in the current climate and in the current conditions. Secondly, we do research to combat the diseases that are fighting or the horrible conditions that are fighting. This would never happen if we didn't care about them. If opening government is correct that we only care about ourselves, why would we ever care about an animal going extinct or about animals suffering insofar we only care about ourselves? Our connection to them is what allows us to lobby for research into animals, what allows us to actually have research that betters their life. Because you're the only side that proves that more animals live, which is prerequisite to anything opening government wants to claim, and the only side proving that the conditions, even though not perfect, are bettering in the long term for the majority of animals proud to own.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech. Now to open the debate, in the closing half, I call member of government.
For every cow that exists, it requires a massive amounts of grain to be bred and to be fed. Why is it the case? It is pure thermodynamics. OO is very much right in the counterfactual. You develop anyways. Why? Because you want to eat wheat, you want to eat bread, etc., which is highly calorically dense. This is the same shit that cows eat. The difference is that when cows eat the same grain, they produce less energy when you eat them, right? Why? Because of thermodynamics. They have to reproduce. They spend energy while they survive, and therefore you have to have more agriculture inside opposition in order to sustain cows. The thing we're going to do in closing government is twofold. One, actually prove the counterfactual, why this harms both domesticated and non-domesticated animals, and then secondly, do some pets, because I think this is part of the debate. Let's do this. What is the most likely counterfaction? OO concedes and says, oh, you farm at the boss of the house. In their side of the house, you farm way more. The reason is because you need to sustain all of this agriculture and livestock that you have, and B, because this livestock requires way more food than it provides back, because of thermodynamics. But also, B, because a lot of that is scrap, right? It is bones. It is like shit, it is piss. I don't need to explain way more. This is all of energy that is wasted, that is not part of the grain. But second of all, the animal world will be more balanced under us of the house. This is for two main reasons. One, because you do less deforestation. In order to build manufacturing, in order to provide for more lands to agriculture, to provide for wheat, you need to cut down the Amazon forest. You need to cut down more forest to build more land. But two, you remove less species from the natural environments, like cows, etc., that will be either predators or animals that predators would feed off. This means that probably in itself the species links are more closer and the biomes are more true. But third thing, and this is where I will flip opening opposition, the necessity to eat meat highly decreases in opposition. Why do people eat meat in the status quo? There are three reasons. One, it is because there is an addiction to meat. This is because it is part of everyday food that you eat, like pastrami, like, all of the little meats that are part of your sandwiches. This doesn't happen inside opposition. Why? Because extraction of meat is way harder. Either because hunting is way, way more energy intensive. This is because one, you have to go into the natural biomes of animals and kill them, which is insanely resource intensive than just kill them on the spot. Or two, because in itself, there is less extraction of meat you can take, like the fat, etc., in the first place. This means that one, meat is way less food, so you don't get addicted to it from young. And second of all, probably it's not part of your tradition, since it has not been domesticated through history. Therefore, in the first place, you eat less meat. Thirdly, there is massive amounts of propaganda for the meat industry through marketing, etc., to be part of everyday food. Therefore, probably the necessity to eat meat decreases. I want you to notice, OO concedes it in the first place. When they say religions are against eating meat through fasting, when they say that traditions are against eating meat through fasting. Like people from the Balkans, years ago, where you did not have meat manufacturing, did not eat that much meat, only very rarely because it was an expensive resource. This means that hunting decreases rapidly under arst of the house, and industrial farming it doesn't happen. No, thank you. This flips all of the harms on biomes that happen inside opposition. What does this mean for our case? One, it is way more likely that non-domesticated animals survive more. Why does the meat industry create immense amounts of pollution? This is for two main reasons. The first is cow belching. They produce an immense amounts of pollution, which increase the amount of environmental harms that happen through pissing in rivers, through belting, etc. This means that lots of animals are harmed the moment that biomes of them are harmed. This means that under rest of the house, zebras, tigers, lions are also harmed the moment you have cows in these factories producing. But B, since you remove their natural source of resources from them being, as they say, things that apex eat, this means that the other animals as well suffer from the lack of it. All of this means that we impact and increase the scale of the debate to an immense degree. Because one, you create way more environmental harm inside opening opposition, that way more animals that are non-domesticated also suffer, which increase the scale in opening government. Plus B, we prove better the counterfactual of opening government. Therefore, opening opposition attacks on, you still eat meat, or you do hunting, massively decrease under arst of the house. Therefore, we protect them way better more, and way over opening government. Before I move on to pets, yes.
Before we domesticated and we hunted them, the likelihood rate is people becoming better at hunting them, so specializing in hunting animals.
No. But this contradicts your case, because you say that the most energy efficient thing to do is farm wheat. Therefore, in a cost trade-off, you would farm wheat over hunting always, because then it will lead to societal collapse, right? Therefore, most likely you do a normal farming and agriculture. Okay, let's go into pets. Why are pets way worse off under side opposition? And I want to have three things on this. One, it is human centrism, i.e., you always want to have power over animals because this is the main way that you are able to extrapolate your own life, etc. The moment you pet a dog, you think, you do it from happiness, but there is a perverse power dynamic, i.e., you squeeze the animal in order to feel satiated and love. This is something that is suffering, right? Because many people don't pet the dogs normally. Many people are actually abusive to their dogs. No, thank you. This creates them choking. This creates them suffering more. But two, I think communication with animals is inherently problematic. Why? Many people think, the dog has sad puppy eyes. This means they're cute. No, guys, they're depressed. You are not able to provide them with proper food. You don't provide them with proper medication. Why? Because you perceive them through the human lens. Therefore, communication always breaks down. Let's take opening opposition to their best and say people want to be good to their animals. So you're not able to communicate with your animal, it is way more likely that you put them in situations of harm, i.e., training. Let's talk a bit about pet training. Pet training is necessary torture. This for two reasons. One, because you want them to make afraid of normal things they do. You do this either through pain, i.e., electrocution of dogs, thank you for the example, or B, suffering from not providing them food, from detracting them from happiness, or from Pavlovian responses, which are basically torture, i.e., if I don't do this, I will not provide you the satiated necessary love for you to survive. Let's do the comparative. OO says, these animals will die in the wild. No, guys. They themselves consider evolution. This means probably they will do evolutionary traits in order to survive in the biomes. Then they say, but you will be afraid of the apex predator, and therefore you're always scared. Why are we debating in the first place? People love thrill and people love engagement in life. They say, oh, the animals will be afraid because predators are next to them. Or maybe this is what derives meaning in their own life in order to continue and survive, in order to be chased away from the predator and therefore survive. But B, I will flip this and say that their happiness then is also way more. Why? Because they can decide with which partner they can breed. Because they can decide what food they will eat. Because they can decide where they will immigrate as an animal. In their side, they're locked in their cage. Or in the best case scenario, they're still not domesticated. But they die from lack of resources, from industrial farming. They die from bad pollution. This weighs over top half. Why? Because A, it's comparative, and B, it has the counterfactual. Vote CG.
Member of the government for that speech. Now, to introduce the case of closing opposition, welcome member of opposition. Here.
Okay, I promised Sofia I would wear this weird hat in the outrounds. So if you guys want to see someone with a weird hat in the final, you know what to vote for. 1 second to set up my timer. Look, I don't know if animals care as much about freedom as government teams tell you. I also have no idea if animals have as much stress in the wild as opening opposition tells you. What we're going to do from closing opposition is not claim that we are animalistic and we know how animals feel most of the time, but we're going to make 3 intrinsic claims. The first is we know that animals care about being alive in many instances. The second is we think they care about having sex. They care about reproduction and all these things because it is animalistic nature. Thirdly, we're going to claim that they care about minimizing pain in many instances because pain just sucks and they oftentimes react horribly to it. I think everything else about freedom, taking walks and getting rubbed is very weird at best. Some people like it, some don't. I'm assuming that's also true for animals as well. I really wouldn't like it if you touched me, but I would like it if someone else did. I don't know why animals have these specific preferences. 2 things to talk about first in characterization. What do we think domestication looks like? I think majority of opening half thinks domestication simply is just we take animals, we put them in a really, really large box and we herd cattle, and that is the extent of the debate that happens on opening half. CG is right, that in some instances, this also just means that you have a large access to pets in themselves. We're going to show you uniquely why this is important for the extension of animal rights that OO tries to run. I think 2 things though to respond to from closing government before I get into this extension. First, they tell you that we're just less likely to eat meat because it is inconvenient. I think 2 responses here. 1, fish. It is so hard for people to get access to fish in status quo. You go out into the ocean in a really large boat in waves that are likely to kill you, and you simply try to attempt to gain a large amount of fish that you're going to go back and eat. I'm unsure why people were unlikely to develop in a similar way with regards to hunting actual animals on their side, because people have been willing to do this even in really hard circumstances. I think secondly, we've done particularly horrible things to gain access to food that is mildly convenient for us. Historically, we literally enslave people just so that we have access to chocolate, which is very, very cheap. I'm unsure why on their side human beings stop doing things just because they've become mildly more inconvenient. I think realistically there's no analysis for why you should buy into the fact that people eat animals a lot less. Second thing that they tell you here, they tell you that the meat industry creates pollution. I think that analysis is downstream of you believing that they eat less meat. I already show you why that's unlikely. I think that defeats the entirety of that case. 2 extensions then. Firstly, on animal rights. I want to note that this is downstream of opening opposition. Opening opposition tells you 2 things about animal rights. 1, they tell you that in status quo, we care about animal rights because of religion. I'm unsure what that has to do with domestication. I don't think that's relevant in the debate. Secondly, they tell you we care about animals because, like, we listen to old McDonald's at a farm and it makes us feel really, really nice about animals. I think our extension here is very simple. 3 things. 1, we claim that this is because people domesticate animals and they have access to things like pets that that they form real relationships with these animals in the very first place. I think two reasons why this is uniquely important. The first is that we think the relationships that people form with their pets off of domestication are oftentimes akin to the relationships that we form with other human beings. Why is this true? Because most people treat their pets like actual relatives that they have. They treat them as friends, they treat them as companions that they literally care intrinsically about. This is uniquely important because if these guys are right, that the only thing that we care about is human beings, it means we achieve that proximity to humanity on our side in closing opposition. This is important because it means that when we care about animals and ascribe them the same fundamental value as human beings, we oftentimes ascribe them all these really, really important rights. There's four impacts to this. One, the most prominent one, you get large amounts of vegans, which means we decrease the number of people who eat meat on their side. Secondly, animal rights groups just rise up a lot more. You have more people willing to fight for and engage with ensuring that animals are a lot more protected. Thirdly, you get research into mercy killings. Even if animals die on our side, on their side you just bludgeon a cow to death. On our side, you're more likely to do it really, really well. OO says this, but I want you to note that the only reason you need to buy into this is the initial analysis on why there is proximity to the animals in the first place. Without that analysis, they can't actually gain access to any of those benefits. I think last thing here, you're just more likely to lobby governments by virtue of that opening. Make it quick.
People aren't binary. How can these obviously different in a desire dog and empathy dissipates when you know a sacrifice is necessary on your end?
Cool. The comparatives is there's no empathy on your side. I don't know what that PI achieves. Second extension here. Why do we think environmental damage was inevitable and why do we think domestication created the necessary conditions for animals to continue existing? I think two things here. Because development was likely to happen on either side. And this is if we concede that people eat less animals on our side, I want you to note that development was still going to happen due to things like capitalism and industrialization. This is important because it meant that we are likely to do things that were going to harm the environment intrinsically. The environment which was foundational in ensuring that animals survived. Why is this uniquely important? Because it meant two things. It means that the living conditions of animals in status quo currently in the world are particularly more shitty than they have ever been. A lot of animals that haven't been domesticated are continuously growing extinct because the environment is almost incapable of ensuring the sustainability. Why is the domestication important? Because it means that in the areas where we domesticate the animals, we create the necessary living conditions to ensure that they survive. Even if it is true that animals are eaten less on our side, there's just less livable places in the environment. We make buildings, we create areas and industries, we go into the wild, we destroy forests just so that we can create parks and other really nice things. On our side, the domestication means we create the necessary conditions for these animals to continue being alive. I think lastly, we just also have an incentive to ensure that animals breed. These guys tell you that this is a bad thing. I told you initially that animals just really, really care about having sex in the very first place. I want you to note that had it not be for human beings consistently putting pandas on planes and taking them all over the world, we would have no pandas in status quo. That incentive for domestication means that we need to ensure their continued sustainability. We ensure that they have sex, that they breed, and that there's more of them. At the end of this debate, I think there's three fundamental things that I proved to you. The first is that we just have more animals alive on our side. This is the biggest thing that animals care about. Secondly, we have actual incentives to ensure that animals have sex on our side, which we also think is really, really important. Lastly, because of the animal rights extension, I also explained to you why we are the most likely team to minimize pain. I think these are the three unique things that animals truly care about. I think anything else that happens in this debate is an emotion that human beings have that all these other teams say animals care about without giving you any actual analysis on why animals uniquely care about this. You're more likely to buy the CEO extension because it is most proximate to what animals truly, truly care about. Even if you buy none of this, I just think people should really think my hat is cool and should vote for CEO regardless.
Is here okay? Or do I need to use this, right? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Give me 1 second. I cannot imagine a worse experience than being hugged by huge dogs that they pet me down and they make me laugh in order for them to laugh more, right? And imagine this, that is the everyday routine that you face when you're being petted, and this happens from the dawn of time, from the history of domestication, from the fucked up concept of ownership and how people feel pleasure through dominating living beings and stuff like that. I think CG is very clean when it comes to how we're going to win this debate. We're going to do this in 3 ways. One, we bypass the internal deadlock on top half, right? Because they have issues on, oh, you have good incentives or you have bad incentives, you domesticate them in a good way or in a bad way. Our harms come from the necessity to sustain domestication in the first place, right? So the capacity that you have to, cut down forest in order to be able to feed more animals, or you have to create more spaces to actually stack up more animals. These are certain harms that happen because of the process of domestication. So it's not how domestication happens, it's about sustaining domestication and creating domestication in the first place. But then secondly, we explain why this environmental collapse fucks up definitely animals that are not domesticated in the first place, right? So this means that food chains collapse more. There are more parasites and there are more biologically, crazy mechanisms that go on and mutations can arbitrarily happen more. But then thirdly, I think the environment becomes worse because there is more polluted water in the first place in order for you to domesticate these type of places and to be able to sustain these places. This means that there are specific harms to neglected animals that are not domesticated in their side of the house, and they feel the downside effects of sustaining domestication in the first place. But then secondly, let's see how we win the comparative better. One, we explain why hunting becomes less, right? So we explain, and OO concedes to this, right? Check your flow. Like the LO concedes that say, oh, you do more weight in order to survive in the dawn of time and stuff like that. This means that the capacity and the pivoting that humanity has to different alternatives is more realistic on government. Why this is the case? One, and I think this is very smart and nobody has said this so far. Hunting has diminishing returns, right? Because things move and plants don't. So this is why domestication happens in the first place, right? Because you want to sustain them in a specific capacity, in a specific region, right? So if you don't do domestication, probably you do something that is more closer to you, so therefore you do more agriculture just for humans, but not to the extent that you do for domestication in order to sustain domestication in the first place, right? But then secondly, I think it is easier for us to explain why eating wheat creates less energetic capacity and threshold and necessities for humans in the first place, right? So all the body works in a lower sustainability because you don't require this type of meat and you don't come back to actually take this type of energetic scaling and stuff like that. Okay, then thirdly, I think we have certain harms on ownership. And this is where we clash with CO, right? And let's see what CO brings to the debate. The first thing they say is that, oh, animals want to have sex and we don't allow them. Guys, look, humans have, a specific pleasure capacity and specific stimuli. Animals don't. Animals reproduce because they need to reproduce and because biology says so. That does not mean they derive the pleasure that humans derive from reproduction, right? So I'm not sure that this is the tipping point of suffering, right? But then secondly, I think our analysis is kind of prior, right? Because the degree we explain the asymmetry between the relationship of the owner and the pet, this becomes significantly worse on CO. I think it's very fluffy and very convenient to say that, oh, you want companionship. And I think this is a very fucked up way to say that companionship works, exactly because humans have specific incentives that are antithetical to the incentives that dogs have. I will later explain on that. Lastly, on utility and animals being more alive. I think most people would agree that living in a bad way and suffering is not the best thing to have in order to actually, being alive in the first place. I'm not sure why there is inherent value to be alive if we prove consistently that you suffer and you have no agency to take your life out, and you have no agency to reverse this. I'm going to take opening, I'm sorry, okay? In order to be able to show this. So I think utility on its own does not matter. And fun fact, if you would prioritize utility, you'd think people like watching people naked if they don't see this could be a good thing. I'm not sure this is a good thing in the first place. I don't think utility is prioritized in most occasions and stuff like that. Let's see what our case does more, right? And about the comparative. And I think these responses are also critical for opening government. So the more I respond to OO, I'm more way over opening government at the beginning in the first place. One, we think there is, like OO says, oh, you make animals fear more and stuff like that. I think one, we explain why living in the wild, defending our comparative, is easier to sustain. One, there is diversity of food chain, right? So different animals eat different plants and stuff like that. Therefore, they have diversity of choice and diversity of capacity. OG says, oh, you can Wild West, you travel more, and therefore you can eat different stuff. In this side of the house, you just get suffocated on specific occasions when they just force you to eat food day in, day out, on the morning or in the night with uncertain capacity. Okay. Let's see now how the relationship works before I go into impacting why having pets is fucked up. Oh.
So degradation will happen either ways because of things like industrialization. The only difference is because of pet ownership, you have enough empathy and political capital.
No. If that was the case, we would have animals having, animal rights and would stop eating meat. Panagis explains the industrialization of meat consumption, and he explains why there are perverse incentives to have campaigns about eating meat. And I think that people have just virtue signaling, right? Because I own a pet, I am allowed to eat more burgers, and exactly because I feel that I'm pet friendly. So I don't think that, this type of capital works from OO. Let's now see the symmetry of relationship. One, I think ownership makes you dictate your actions, and I think this scales up also the biological inbreeding that Banagis says, right? Because look, when I think that, this type of pet has to, reflect my own image and my own fashion, I am forcing the pet to do different stuff to look nice back to me, right? So I cut its hair, I make it wear stuff and all of this stuff. I make it laugh, or I make it scream, or I make it go to walks and stuff like that. I think there is some type of zero-sum utility. The more I want to stay home and watch Netflix, the dog wants to pee. And therefore, if they cannot pee, therefore they cannot actually go out and they don't have agency on that specific front. I think the Pavlovian treatment also scales on CG, right? Because OG says, if they bite, you get punished. But CG explains why there are specific behaviors that is certain to all relationships. Even if you love your dog so much, you have to punish it hardly to not do the specific things again and again, which is very harsh and certain harm to this type of occasions, right? But I think there are so many weird people that they do weird stuff to animals, and domestication allows this stuff to actually scale up. One, I think it is more certain that people that get animals have some type of, a priori agency on them, and they make them suffer in order for them to have specific pleasure, and for them to be able to actually get some type of social gravitas through this. But then secondly, I think hunting and domesticating can be washed off, but specifically bypassing your agency as an animal and being forced to have a specific lifestyle is fucking tremendous. Vote CG if you value your liberty.
Wait for that speech. Now to close the debate inside opposition and the debate as a whole, I call opposition whip. Here.
Okay. Sorry? Okay. Panel, opening opposition claims to you that the biggest problems that animals face exist naturally, that these animals would have been hunted regardless, and that the biggest predator that these animals are facing in the wild are other animals. We tell you that the biggest predator that these animals are facing has throughout history been humans, and it's important that these very humans are the ones that are actively redressing the harms that they've caused to these animals. We're able to mechanize and show you effectively in closing opposition how this domestication firstly has the capacity to reduce the harms that these animals are facing because of what humans have done. But secondly, we're able to show you how those benefits extend to animals that exist in the wild. We're able to show you how majority of those benefits simply exist because of the research capacity that we've enhanced, because of the empathy that we've created towards animals. To that end, we think the flimsy responses that you get from opening opposition to opening government cannot stand in this debate. Secondly, the unmechanized claims as to how you get empathy and as to how you create better conditions for animals do not stand over the extension that Menz is able to bring in this debate. Menz is able to show you three things: that we have the capacity to keep these animals alive, that we have the capacity to ensure that these animals are able to continue mating so that they can reproduce, so that we have more of these animals, and lastly, that we create the conditions for these animals to be able to adapt in an environment that we've actively harmed. We think this is important insofar as we're the only team that's able to prove to you how we best cater to the things that these animals mostly care about. On the mechanisms as to why you get better animal rights, in our case, we're able to show you that that active empathy that we create ascribes these animals rights that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten. We show you how there's an active incentive to have more animal rights groups that that are able to mitigate the harms that are happening to these animals. This is important insofar as we're able to show you that domestication creates an active incentive for like a public outcry as to how these animals are treated and so on and so forth. We're able to show you how you get research, how you get like veterinary scientists that actively care for these like animals and lobby governments to create better conditions, not only for these domesticated animals, but for the animals that exist in the wild as well. The very important context that you are supposed to deal with in today's debate is that this environmental degradation otherwise would have been inevitable, and how we actively deal with that environmental degradation. To deal then with the government teams before I move on. The first claim from closing government is this idea that because of the law of thermodynamics, it means that we're going to need more agriculture so that we create more cows so that they produce more meat. I did an animal science degree. It might not get me a job, but this is how it makes me win this debate. Note, panel, that in the majority of circumstances, if we were to sustain the human population using agriculture, it would actively mean that we're clearing expansive amounts of land and we're clearing away like the very environment that these animals otherwise would have relied on to be able to get the food that they need. The problem in a world where domestication doesn't exist is that humans do not actively redress that harm that they are inevitably causing to these animals. We don't think we're farming these like plants that you claim that we're going to eat if we were not domesticating animals and eating them in the air. We're farming them actively on environments that these animals rely on. Domestication has actively led to the creation of environments that these animals can actively deal with. We think that is important. Secondly, they tell us that the meat industry creates more pollution. Again, this very argument that I've already given you responds to that idea. We think you create more pollution at a point at which you are engaging in expansive agriculture that is inefficient. They posit that humans have actively created mechanisms to make killing these animals more efficient, to make killing these animals a lot faster. We think the very domestication of animals has also led to research that makes them know that you get more protein from animals, because without the domestication of animals, we wouldn't have had that comparative in the first place. We think this then posits that at the end of the day, the active research that we do into these animals, because of that close proximity to them, and because of caring about them, and because of humans actively wanting more meat, is something that has led to us being able to create this non-meat protein alternatives, because we've actively discovered that we need more of that. Opening government, go.
On our comparative, humans cannot go all out animals because it collapses the ecosystem even for farming. On your side, there's infinite demand and capacity to cause harm to farming.
I've literally analyzed how there isn't an infinite demand for animals for the mere fact that we're able to research into these non-protein alternatives, because we love meat so much and we're able to realize through the domestication of these animals that we actively need it. They're also then going to tell you that evolutionary adaptations in the wild would have ensured that these animals are able to survive. Notice, panel, because of the insane levels of damage that we're causing to the environment, evolutionary adaptations wouldn't have catered for these animals, because the way that they evolve and the way that they adapt doesn't mean they see fire today and they wake up tomorrow and they can survive that fire. Evolutionary adaptations take millions of years to be able to cater for these animals. So because we're actively creating an environment that makes it difficult for the evolutionary adaptations of these animals to keep up, we have to create an environment where we cater for them, where we care for them, where we treat them like babies that deserve the care that they need. And you only get that in a world where we actively domesticate these animals. They then go on to reduce our point as to how this domestication is something that actively means that these animals are able to reproduce. The claim here is that because we've identified the harms that these animals face, and because we're more proximate to them, we know what they need for survival, we create the conditions for them to be able to reproduce better. To that end, we show you how we breach that gap that we've created, and we're able to give them the necessary means of adaptation. Opening opposition's responses to opening government are flimsy at best. I'm going to be very clinical here and respond to majority of the claims that they bring. They tell us that humans are actively genociding animals, that humans have created mechanisms to kill these animals in very large amounts. Note, the alternative in opening government's world is one where actively taking very blunt spears and bludgeoning these animals to death. We think in so Insofar as they claim that they do not want these animals to suffer pain, insofar as they claim that they do not want these animals to be abused, we think we're better for them because we create like these messy killings and we create environments where these animals are ultimately treated better at the end of the day. We think also when they go on to tell us about how there's like genetic engineering and so on and so forth, this is literally the way that we enable these animals to adapt to the conditions that we've created. We think when you genetically engineer these animals, you give them the capacity to survive, you give them the capacity to reproduce, because in the natural environment, all those traits that are needed for their survival have actively been weeded out. We think at a point at which we genetically engineer them, we create conditions for them to survive. Closing opposition. Thank you.